Hello, it's Craig here with a breakdown for Twinblades, a weapon type I'm sure many people associate with status effects because you can throw out many hits within a short amount of time, either with the power stance attacks like the jump attack that hits 4 times, or the two-handed movesets. And since we're talking about movesets, let us start with the different movesets of some of the Twinblades. This is the regular heavy and charged heavy attack of Twinblades. You can probably intuitively feel that the two-handed moveset is better even on the heavy attacks, and it is. The two-handed Twinblade moveset allows one extra instance of the Twinblade to hit for each attack. This is the unique heavy and charged heavy attack of the Eleonora's Poleblade, which applies to both the one-handed and two-handed versions. This is the unique heavy and charged heavy attack of the Godskin Peeler. It also applies to both one-handed and two-handed versions. One thing to note is, status effects have motion values, or damage percent of their own. So every hit does not necessarily mean 100% of your status effect on the weapon is applied. So keep in mind your power stance jump attacks, for example, does not apply 200% status damage for each weapon, but rather 140% for each weapon. It still applies more status damage than most power stance attacks, but I'm making sure you know every hit doesn't necessarily mean 100% of your status damage, which is something I don't think many people know in detail. This is also not just a Twinblade thing, as it applies to other multi-hit attacks. This is the regular running heavy attack of Twinblades. This is the unique running heavy attack of the Godskin Peeler. Next, let us take a look at the Twinblades' weapon ranges. The two Gargoyles are quite a bit shorter, but other than those two Twinblades, everything else is about the same length. Now let us take a look at the attack rating, otherwise known as AR, of the Twinblades to draw some conclusions, starting with the unique Twinblades. This is the Gargoyle's Black Blade, which does not have a unique weapon art. For this Twinblade, I will be showing the stat distribution like so, because there is incentive to two-hand Twinblades for its moveset. A one-handed Twinblades moveset is quite frankly weak. It doesn't have high poise damage, a fast attack, reach, or anything for that matter, so Twinblades usually stick to two-handing. If you're holding Twinblades in one hand, it would mostly be because you want to power stance Twinblades for the jump attack. As you can see, because two-handing a weapon uses a 1.5 times strength multiplier for AR calculation, the stat distributions are slightly different. This is something you might want to keep in mind when you're deciding on which Twinblade to use. The stat distribution varies even more when you reach this level of investment. As for the Gargoyle's Black Blade itself, we will talk more about the viability of this weapon when we get to the regular section. The other unique Twinblade is the Eleonora's Poleblade. Thematically, you can tell this is made like the Rivers of Blood, which also has space bleed, arcane scaling, and a physical fire split damage. So just like the Rivers of Blood, even though it has a D scaling in arcane and a C scaling in dexterity, arcane investment is still superior. That is because arcane scales both the physical and fire damage, while dexterity only scales the physical. And to top all of that off, the arcane also scales bleed, which is a decent amount when reaching the 45 soft cap of status scaling. The stats on the bottom are for its higher investment level, where you begin to invest into dexterity for more AR. This is a Twinblade, so two-handing it is still great, but the strength multiplier will barely benefit this weapon. The unique weapon art, Bloodblade Dance, probably explains why the Rivers of Blood is often complained about, while this weapon is not. While Corpse Piler has a greatly extended range from double slash, Bloodblade Dance is basically an upgraded Loretta slash that hits more times. There is no extended range, but it does give you the upside of having bleed on the weapon art that is usually done with magic infusion. One other difference is that the Bloodblade Dance allows for a follow-up dodge maneuver. Still, Loretta's slash is quite the telegraph move, and so is Bloodblade Dance, so I would say this is better for PvE than it is for PvP. Now let us move on to the regular Twinblades. We have the Twinblade, the Twin Knight Swords, Gargoyle's Blade, and Godskin Peeler. Let's start with the heavy infusion. The dexterity requirements for Godskin is not met here, but it won't negatively affect the AR. Think of it as more stat points you must pay to run it on heavy, which you probably won't anyway. This is done for better standardization. Generally speaking though, I'd say if you're going to be using Twinblades, you're probably going to be using it with status effects to maximize the potential of the weapon, so we'll only be taking a brief look at these non-status effect infusions. For the strength scaling Twinblades, you would mostly be deciding between the Twin Knights or the Gargoyles. The difference between these two Twinblades tend to come down to preferring the length or the AR. You should also keep in mind that despite the Gargoyle being 0.5 weights heavier, it is less heavy on the stat requirement because the Twin Knight requires 18 dexterity, while the Gargoyle only requires 15. These are the stats for the Fire Infusion, and these are their stats at the 80 strength investment level. These are the stats for the Keen Infusion, and here we can group the Twinblades up into those that scale better to strength or dexterity for the status effect infusions later. Twin Knight Swords and Gargoyles scale better to strength, while Twinblade and Godskin Peeler scale better to dexterity. But despite that, you will find that the Twin Knight Sword, which is longer and only 1 weight heavier than the Twinblade, has higher AR than the Twinblade that scales better to dexterity. Since their movesets are the same, the Twin Knight Sword is basically a better Twinblade, save for one niche scenario where you don't have the extra stats to meet the strength requirements of the Twin Knight Sword. Generally speaking though, the Twinblade is a weak Twinblade. These are the stats for the Lightning Infusion. And here, since Lightning Infusion is not tied to Keen Infusion, we can see that the Gargoyles that scales better to strength has higher AR than the Godskin that scales better to dexterity. Okay, it is time to revisit the Gargoyle's Blackblade by comparing it to the Gargoyle's Twinblade. If we're using these stats, these are the AR for each of the Twinblades. Greases give 85 damage of your pick, which would put the regular Gargoyles at 643 AR. However, we have to remember that the regular Gargoyle doesn't need 22 Faith to apply Grease. Instead, let us take a look at this same exact amount of stat distribution, but with seals. If you've watched my mono-scaling spells video, you will know that these buffs only scale to Faith spell buff, rather than the entire spell buff of the seal. Therefore, with this stat distribution, your strongest seal to use buffs with is the Finger Seal. And let us use Order's Blade to compare holy damage. In actual combat, you have 4 buffs to choose from. The Lightning Armament works exactly the same as the Order's Blade, for example, but doesn't have the intelligence requirement, and is a stronger element against most things in general, including PvP. So basically, we're getting an elemental damage boost equal to 75% of our Faith spell buff, which would give us a 122 AR boost. Adding that to 558 AR, we get 680 AR, which is higher than the Gargoyle Blackblade by 21 AR. At a higher Faith investment, we can repeat the same thing. Doing this will yield 752 AR for the Gargoyle's Twinblade, which is 53 AR worth of difference. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, sure, you can find niche uses for the Gargoyle's Blackblade, but personally, I wouldn't recommend it, even if you don't want to use status effects for Twinblades. Next, for quality infusion. This is mostly a PvE thing at endgame levels because it costs too many stat points to make the AR match up to either the heavy or the keen infusion. If you are going to use a quality Twinblade, you can still use buffs for your Twinblade. Twin Knight Swords is the clear winner here in terms of raw AR, beating even the Gargoyles. You would be deciding between the Twin Knight and whether or not you want the Godskin's unique moveset. Flame and Sacred are not something I would recommend for Twinblades. These are usually options better for mixing with the seal on your offhand, but a Twinblade's one-handed moveset is bad. You might as well use a straight sword. But if you are going to use this infusion, note that the Twinblade and Twin Knight swords are very close in AR, so this is a great instance where you can forego 6 extra points of strength as previously mentioned. Magic is basically Flame and Sacred for intelligence, so once again, not really recommended. You're better off with another weapon choice for mixing with staffs. Alright, Occult Infusion has really messy stat spreads for maximizing each Twinblade, so I'll go over them one by one. While this is indeed a status infusion, you will need a fire weapon to reset the frost proc in order to be able to proc cold again. Otherwise, you won't be able to proc frostbite again when frostbite is still up. This is a bit more detrimental for Twinblades than some other weapon types with cold infusion, because as a Twinblade you rely on the damage from the status proc itself. As an additional note, Eleonora's Twinblade does indeed remove the frostbites on the enemy, but it's not a good combination with Cold Infusion, as your stat distribution would be vastly different. And it also makes Poison Infusion not a great choice, because you can't proc more poison while the enemy is already poisoned. So Blood Infusion is probably your best bet. Again, Twin Knight Swords versus the Gargoyles is a question of AR or length. As for the Godskin Peeler, it scales better to dexterity and also has a unique moveset. The choice is yours. Now, let us take a look at the Blood Infusion weapons versus the Eleonoras. We do see that the Eleonora has quite a chunk more AR than the Blood Infused weapons. But remember, it is a split scaling weapon, which naturally has more AR. Still, the AR difference is enough for the Eleonora to do a tad bit more damage on the average enemy at around this stat investment level. But the real problem is the bleed status effect on the Eleonora. For a tad bit of damage loss, the Twin Knight, Godskin, and Gargoyles have 63% more bleed buildup than the Eleonora. This makes them much better weapons for attacking with. The only reason you would want the Eleonora is if you really like the aesthetics or the weapon art. As for the Occult Infusion, there are no infusible Twinblades with base status effect, so this isn't great. And to begin with, for the same amount of stat investment, Occult loses to either the heavy version or the keen version. So yeah, not recommended. Let's do a quick summary for the Twinblades. I don't recommend using the Gargoyle's Blackblade. You can achieve better performance with a more varied option using the regular Gargoyles. As for the Eleonoras, I would only use this if you really like the weapon art or the aesthetics of the weapon itself. And since the weapon art is a bit too telegraphed for the second part to land, I mostly suggest this for PvE. As for the regular Twinblades, the only reason to consider the Twinblade over the Twin Knight Swords is if you don't want a high strength investment, because you're using an infusion like Flame or Sacred, and other parts of your build don't use strength. The cases where this isn't straight up a bad choice are far and few in between, and I don't recommend the Twinblade. The main decision for the infusible Twinblade for a strength-oriented build with a regular moveset is either the Twin Knight Swords for the longer reach or the Gargoyles for the higher AR. The advantage of having a strength build over the Godskin's dexterity build is when you're two-handing the Twinblade, it gets a bigger boost to AR. As for the Godskin Peeler, you're going to pick this mainly because you like its unique moveset, since dex build doesn't benefit as much from two-handing as strength builds. In terms of stats, the Godskin is very similar to the Twin Knight, having a slightly higher AR on Blood Infusion with dex versus the Twin Knight in one-handed form, and being just slightly shorter too. Very comparable in terms of base stats, so you're deciding whether you want the better two-handed bonus for the Twin Knight or the unique moveset of the Godskin. If you want to support my work, I need some help with getting my fantasy novel, The House of Hounds, out there, so please buy a copy. It's a carefully crafted story packed with mystery, adventure, and magic. Like and subscribe. See you next time.